Today is Evan Ratliff, who I'm really excited that he's here, and Lee Hotz will give the formal introduction, but I will just say that we are grateful to Evan and the Atavist for many reasons, including choosing one of our students as his very first employee, Olivia Koski. There she is.
She's right there.
There she is. Olivia is a very entrepreneurial-minded student. She always was, and the Atavist is a perfect spot for her, and she's doing really cool stuff, including with Creativist, which we will learn more about today from Evan. So I'll just say personally, Evan, thank you very much for coming, and while Lee will formally introduce you, it's really great that you're here for multiple reasons. Many of us really, really love writing long with a great passion, and we are very excited about new platforms to do that, and we're especially excited when those platforms are paired with economic models that actually work. And I guess it's a little early, maybe still, to draw that conclusion, but the early returns are good, so we're excited about that. Anyway, with that, I will turn it over to the moderator for the evening, Robert Lee Hotz, distinguished writer in residence here at the Carter Institute, and science writer for the Wall Street Journal. Lee, it's all yours.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. We are very fortunate this evening to have as our guest Evan Ratliff, who is, I'll go on at great fulsome length here for a minute, is not only a very talented and successful journalist, but he's also enabling the work of a great many other people as a publisher and I guess a startup entrepreneur, do-it-yourself publisher, a DIY publisher.
Yeah, for better or worse.
For better or for worse. So far for better, as best I can tell. But this is a conversation, not a lecture, and to make it work as we get rolling, I want to encourage all of you to chime in, to interrupt with your own questions to help us digress in interesting and creative ways. So, Evan, as many of you may know, is the co-founder, CEO, and editor of an online publishing venture called The Atavist. But he is, in a purer realm, an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in The New Yorker and the National Geographic, Wired. Actually, his work at Wired we're going to talk about in a minute, because there was a period of his life when there was a $5,000 reward out for this man.
That's why seeing all these pictures everywhere is really, it freaked me out.
Yes, yeah. He almost turned around in the elevator because he saw this wanted poster and it reminded him of his life on the lam. But it is most prominently as a creator of The Atavist, and the underlying software, storytelling, narrative, long-form software that makes this kind of publishing possible that we're going to want to focus on Evan tonight. The Atavist, for those of you who don't know, is a site that, for pay, is publishing long-form narrative pieces, 9,000-word pieces, with embedded interactive graphics, video, photography, kind of anything that you want to put your mind to. But what's interesting about it as a model is that they also have had a great deal of success, first licensing it for free to people who as individuals want to publish something of their own, and there are thousands of writers out there who've taken advantage of this, but also in a more industrial scale and potentially profitable form of licensing. Groups like TED and the Paris Review are now using it. But I guess I'd like to start, Evan, if I may, by putting you back in your undergraduate shoes. And I'm always interested in
another drink.
And well, we could, the drink is always handy. You grew up in Atlanta. You went to Duke. At Duke, you were an environmental science and policy major, a major that's always fraught with great, rich career opportunities. But you also were a sports photographer, yeah?
Yeah, I was a photographer for the newspaper, the Duke Chronicle. That was like my only real journalism experience in college was I actually went into the newspaper thinking maybe I want to be a writer, like when I first got to college, and there was a huge line of like ambitious, wide-eyed people waiting to like learn about reporting, and there were a bunch of people sitting in the photo department drinking beer, and no one wanted to be a photographer, so I just went over there and said, maybe I'll just do this instead. So I spent 4 years doing photography, and at Duke, like basketball is like, you know, religion and then some, which I kind of object to, but that did enable me to do a lot of sports photography, and they sent me all over the country to shoot games.
Interesting. But so when you graduated, then you surely went straight into working as a photojournalist. And
Yeah.
Is that what happened?
No, I wanted to be a photographer. I mean, my dream was to be a National Geographic photographer, basically, or at least start out as a newspaper photographer. And I remember I went to the career center and I said, how do I go about getting a job as a photographer? And they literally said to me, have you thought about consulting or investment banking? Because that's a great way to make a living, and then you could do photography. I sort of thought, well, okay, I'll try on my own. So I sent my portfolio. It'd be funny to look at it now, like what constituted my portfolio, out to a bunch of newspapers, still at the time, like fairly viable newspapers in New Orleans and San Francisco and all over the place, and not a single one even responded to my. Nobody even said this is pretty good work, but you need to work harder. It was just like nothing.
Yeah, I feel obliged to chime in here and say that although I mentioned a minute ago that his work has appeared in National Geographic, it is not his work as a photographer.
They did not let me take photos for that story. They pay, in fact, for National Geographic, they pay someone 5 times what you're making to go shoot the photos.
So clearly the photography thing didn't go anywhere very quickly, but you ended up in Amsterdam working as a software consultant, which clearly will become of interest later in our conversation. But sort of how did that happen? That's not a normal jump of interest from sort of environmental policy to hardcore code monkey.
Yeah, I think that I think my backup to being a photographer was that I thought I'll get some job out of my major, environmental science. But at the time, that major was a very new thing. And so, first of all, it was a BA, it wasn't a BS, so I couldn't get a real science job. And then they basically said you could work for the EPA maybe, or you could work for the Sierra Club, and I couldn't find any job that interested me. So as a kid, my dad was a college professor who was also an entrepreneur. So he had several software companies.
This was at?
He was at Georgia Tech. Yeah, he's an engineering professor at Georgia Tech, still is. And he had some software companies that I worked at. That was my summer job when I was a kid, and I used to work with the head of engineering, and he taught me programming, basically. Then it was languages that are not used anymore, like Pascal was the language that I learned originally. And then, so when I graduated, that guy who had been the head of engineering was now moved to Amsterdam to deal with some clients that they had in Amsterdam. So he said, why don't you just come work here? So I did. So I worked there for a year, and actually we covered the whole world. So we went, I went to Finland for a month and did a project with the Finnish Postal Service. It was software that routed trucks mostly. I went to Singapore for a month and did there's some sad Pepsi distributor in Singapore that's still using the stuff that I coded probably to route their trucks around the city and things like that. So, but I discovered pretty quickly I didn't really want to do that as a job.
You didn't?
Yeah, it was just, the part of the problem was I was young and I really enjoyed living in Amsterdam, but the jobs themselves, I would go to say work with the Finnish Postal Service or the Pepsi distributor. I was working with middle management people who, granted, were interesting because they were from other cultures, but what I learned is middle management, white collar people are the same everywhere, all over the world. They're a little unhappy and they're a little sort of let's just get this done and get out the door. And I was 23 years old and I was kind of had entered this world that I just thought, what am I doing here? this is like a place you end up. This is not a place, and like against your will. Like this is not a place you like start out and say like, this is for me.
So are you starting to have bad hotel dreams where you wake up and you're a middle management zombie? And I mean,
literally, literally yes. I didn't. And it sounds like I told you this in advance, but I used to have this dream. This is taking me back, where there was like a wall of like, there were like holes in the wall, and it was like a giant computer, and I was programming it by sticking my hand in the hole, and I had to like turn a lever, but some of them were filled with fire. I'm not joking. I'm not making this up.
Really?
Yeah, I had that dream like 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, this is very Saw. I mean,
yeah, it was terrifying. And then I thought, like, maybe there's something. Maybe I'd like to do something else.
Okay, yeah. So, all right. So the sports photography thing apparently was not like a great choice. Environmental policy seems to have been even, well, you know, interesting, mind-broadening. It's a good thing to do. And your career as a software consultant seems to be, I don't know, causing you nightmares and maybe seeds of a drinking problem.
It's troubling.
What happens then?
Well, I guess I had a notion in my head. I always loved the magazines. I used to subscribe. Harper's was a magazine that I loved more than I subscribed to Harper's. I've probably been a subscriber to Harper's since like 1990 or something. And there was a magazine that it was affiliated with the newspaper in college, and I worked on that a little bit. I was a photo editor of that, and I even wrote one story for it. And I just had this idea in my head that magazines were just like the nirvana of place to work. It seemed the opposite of the place that I was working. It was like a place where people just talked about ideas and were excited about ideas and excited about stories. And so I thought, I'm gonna get a job at a magazine somehow. So I applied to internships. I think I applied to internships at magazines, if I recall, that weren't in New York for the most part, because I thought like the people in New York, I don't know anything in that world, but the ones other places, maybe I'll have a chance. So like Mother Jones, Wired, local regional magazines, Sierra Magazine, Sierra Club, and again, most of them. I remember I got a postcard from Mother Jones, which I kept for many years. That said like, thank you for sending it.
They were not quick to recognize your unique contribution that you could make to their.
No, I didn't have any
venture,
clips.
Yeah?
I had
No
I had 3 clips.
3 clips.
I had 3 clips. One of them was a story about like phone service at Duke. It was terrible. One of them was a photography exhibit review, and one of the story I wrote about a jazz professor at Duke, which was a longer piece for the magazine. Yeah. And later, so I got an internship at Wired, and much later, the person who gave it to me, first of all, he told me that he'd only given it to me because they forgot to hire an intern. Because they just sold the company to Condé Nast, and so it was like all in disarray. And he also told me that at the time, he was sort of like really impressed that I had only sent 3 clips because they asked for 5. And he thought like, this guy's really like putting his best work forward. It's just like,
and he knows how to route trucks. So this is,
well, yeah.
I mean, but just to linger on the internship thing for a second. So you got completely shut out in your first round. Nobody even responded to you except the postcard. So there you are. What do you do then?
Well, I started calling Wired. Wired was the one that I thought, maybe they'll hire me because I know about technology. Like I understand software. Little did I know that like you didn't need to know that to work at Wired, especially at that time. But so I started calling. I got the person at the front desk, and eventually that person, probably against the rules of their job, like put me through to someone.
So you just cold calling?
Yeah, I just.
You don't even have
them.
a name.
No, I didn't even know who. I just said, could you connect me with the person who's in charge of the internship I'm calling to check on my application?
Oh,
kind of
very
thing.
clever.
And put me through to someone who was this guy named Bill Goggins, who he sort of started taking my calls. Like then I got his number and I kept calling him, and then he said, well, I can't do anything for you right now, but if you're ever in San Francisco, call me. And then we were doing work with Nokia, and they had an office in Sausalito across the bay. And so I was in town and I called him, and he said, okay, let's meet. And it's sort of a longer story, but basically he kept putting me off all day, and then he said, well, I'm having dinner with my wife, and then we'll get a drink. So we got a drink at like 9, and then he found out that I had not ever been to San Francisco. So then he said, oh, I got to show you around. So he basically took me on a bar crawl of North Beach in San Francisco where he lived, And I think, who remembers, but I had like 6 Manhattans, probably the most Manhattans I've ever had in my life, because he loved Manhattans. We had to get one at every bar. And then we went to Tosca's in North Beach, and then he said, finally he said, well, I just got to ask you, what do you think you can contribute to Wired Magazine?
This was after 8 Manhattan.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't have,
So you'd
I
softened
don't remember
him up.
what I
All
said,
right, okay,
but
yeah.
the next day I called him back and he said, all right, if you can start in a month, the internship is yours.
And internship, so this was as a fact checker, yes?
I
essentially?
started as they called it the editorial internship, so it was opening the mail and the email.
And this was like, what, $8 an hour?
It was exactly $8 an hour, actually. Yeah, and it was the excitement of it was when the Unabomber was still at large. So it was like there was a big poster in the mailroom about how you were supposed to open the mail in case it was a bomb.
Right. If it's addressed to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which wasn't useful. It was always like, put it under the desk. Like, that doesn't help
really?
me.
Yeah.
It was just about saving everyone else.
I have this picture of you like in big padded, body armor.
There was no
around,
gear. They didn't give us any gear for
really?
it. But yeah, so
the
I
box
did that
cutter,
before once.
I mean. Okay, so you're a fact checker. You're at, the hip magazine startup at that era. It must have been a very exciting place. But you're in the mailroom, literally.
Yeah, I was part of the editorial team, so I opened the editorial mail,
Yeah.
so like the books, the random books that people will send, and I answered the email, the editorial email, and it was actually a great time to be at Wired because it was the beginning of the real .com boom. It was like 1998, to 2000, where it was just like blowing up in this amazing but also gross way. But because I answered the email, a lot of the emails were, inviting reporters to come to parties. I basically ate and drank for free for like 2 years. Because I asked someone, like, I would always forward them to reporters, and I would say, like, do you guys want to go? And they were like, no, we're not going to these stupid parties. They just want us to write about them. If you want to go, go. So I would always RSVP myself and all my friends.
Well, I'm glad you.
journalism
I'm glad you
start.
got something out of the .com boom because, well, so many people went bust.
Well,
all right, so I don't want to drag out your biography unduly because you're still in the middle of writing it. How do you get from, let's charitably say, a relatively menial $8 an hour job, answering other people's potentially explosive mail, into long form narrative? How do you become a contract writer? How did you make that jump?
Well, it was mostly through being a fact checker. So after I did that internship, I got a fact checking internship there, and then I became an associate research editor, which is basically a fact checker, and then I ran the research desk. And that was really like both where I got excited about doing journalism and writing long form, and where I learned basically everything I know about it today even. Was sort of working with writers, working with the editors there. There were amazing editors at Wired at that time. There are today as well. But and so that was kind of like my first step, was sort of like learning how things worked, and then sort of I started seeing the stories come in from these writers, and started saying, first of all, if you ever work at a magazine, even the best magazine that you can think of, and I know the one you're thinking of all in your mind right now, and you saw the first draft of things that came in, you would be amazed at some of the writers that you love, that you see the first draft and you're like, wow, like maybe I could write a first draft like that. Like maybe I could. Like it never really occurred to me before that I could do it until I kind of saw like they come in not that great and the editors do a lot of work for a lot of them. And so then the second part of it was I noticed that we were all sitting in an office somewhere, which was a wonderful place to work, and I did love working in a magazine. And these people got to go all over the world, and for some reason they were paid to just like travel the world and write about it. And I thought, well, that seems like the thing to do to try to get that job.
Yeah, so this doesn't sound very crafty here. I mean, I was waiting for you to tell me about how you wanted to corner sort of the sports photography gig for Wired, because of course they do so much of that. So how did you pitch your first story to Wired? I mean, how did you, I understand the newsrooms are magical places. It's great to be around all those grown-up children, with expense accounts. But I don't see where your foot goes from that step to that step to that step. and then I want to jump on to something else, but I'd really like to know how you bridge
Yeah,
that.
well, I mean, it was fortunate. It was a fortunate environment in a couple of ways. One of which was that it was the dot-com boom, which meant the magazines were huge. Like a magazine like Wired was getting so much advertising that like they couldn't even fill the feature well. Because they had to keep up a certain number of features because of ad edit ratios. So they were, there was just a lot of space to write. It wasn't like, now where you're like scrapping and fighting over the feature well. It was sort of like, we've got another 5,000 words, what are we gonna do with it? And it was also fortunate because for whatever reason, the editor at the time, who was a woman named Katrina Herron, who had been at the New Yorker and other places, she was just incredibly sort of egalitarian and generous about she didn't care who did stuff. So at some point I asked, like, is it okay if I pitch features? And then not only did they let me pitch features, but sometimes if they had a story, they would come over and say, like, do you want to look into this? So it was just a really lucky environment. And I started doing, like many people, I started doing short things, and then I kind of like had more ambition, and I was like probably like relatively annoying and precocious in terms of like always pitching stories and people always saying, like, no, that's not quite right, but gradually you sort of like learn why they're saying no.
So you get yourself comfortable as a contract writer for Wired. You've got a 4-story contract?
The first year, actually the only contract I ever had was when I left the magazine from being the research editor, and they gave me a 4-story contract for 1 year.
Yeah, of which you only sort of actually did 2 stories.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I only did 2 stories that I got paid for. Basically, they gave me this 4-story contract, and sort of simultaneously, I was like trying to, I don't know, I was trying to figure out sort of like lifestyle-wise what I wanted to do, and I had some friends moving to Hawaii, and I'd always wanted to live in Hawaii, so I did 2 stories really quickly, and then I thought, this is easy, I can knock out these stories, whenever I want. So I moved to Hawaii, and then I probably didn't do anything for the rest of the year. And when that happens, basically their contract, they're paying you like every month, and you just have to deliver the 4 stories over that time period, and then you get to the end, and if you haven't done it, then you have to deliver them for free, or like totally ruin your reputation. So I worked for like 5 months unpaid to like actually deliver the stories that I was owed.
And that's your one and only contract?
That's the only writing contract I ever had.
Well, that seems kind of scary.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's sort of like freelancing was always a trade-off between being terrified about where the check's gonna come from and this sort of like incredible freedom of no one can hold anything over your head. I mean, that was the thing about the contract, is because I had approached it in this really like inappropriate, immature way, it also felt really like constricting. Like, I don't want one of these contracts, like then at the end they own you. Whereas like most writers today, probably including myself, a writing contract is like gold, it's like you have something coming in every month. But I was just very much like, I want to be able to do whatever I want, and I wanted to not get stuck just writing for Wired. I wanted to write for other places. I wanted to try to pitch other magazines. So I just didn't want any restrictions. I figured I could live as cheaply as I needed to live to like make do on whatever I made. I could do fact-checking freelance, I could do research, but I didn't want anyone stopping me from like writing the stories that I wanted to write.
And you're based in San Francisco at this point?
Yep.
Still, okay. So one of the things that is interesting to me about your makeup is that you clearly have a sense of story journalism enterprise as event. You do a performance magazine called PopUp Magazine, which we'll talk about in a minute. And you also sort of do the long-form podcast with some of your colleagues. But I'd like to sort of linger on this just for a second, because of course it involves like one of the projects that you're most well known for, or maybe I should say notorious for, I'm not so sure. But as a writer with Wired, you came up with this idea of doing a story that was in fact about your effort to disappear in the United States and live off the grid for a certain period of time. And so it became not just a kind of a narrative of your effort to escape the constraints of modern life, but also this kind of national scale puzzle game. thing. And I just wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about how that came to be, because it seemed almost accidental. I mean, not, again, like your sports photography career, not like a well planned out, well thought out scheme, but something that seemed to sort of just pop.
Yeah, it was fairly accidental in the sort of origin of it. I mean, I was always, I think what I really got interested in, the time I really got completely interested in journalism was when someone gave me, actually it was John Heilemann, who's now like famous for writing Game Changers and things like that. I think he either gave me or just told me to buy a copy of the New Journalism. So, you know, probably a lot of people in this room have the same experience. Like, I felt like I had one view of journalism, and then I read that and I sort of thought, like, this stuff is amazing. Like, what if you could do these types of things, take this literary approach and first-person approach? And I always loved first-person stories. I was obsessed with Hunter Thompson, but I think I also had the benefit of, this is a long backstory to the Wired thing, but benefit of like really good editors who I would talk to about that stuff, who sort of also instilled in me that if you try to do that kind of thing and you're aping the style of Hunter Thompson, that like there's no other Hunter Thompson. Like, you can't do that anymore. Like, you can do your version of it. And I used to have all these conversations with editors and writers about that kind of stuff. And so it kind of played into when this topic, it was basically a topic that my editor and I were talking about, which is people who fake their own death. And I was really trying to find a story around that, and I kept throwing stories at him, and he kept saying, that's not quite enough to do a whole Wired piece on.
So you had a topic that you were interested, a
Yeah.
subject.
Yeah, that's the classic like, topic, not a story.
People faking their deaths, but you had no story. So you're sitting with, this is with Nick Thompson, yeah?
Yeah, who was my editor at Wired at the time.
Who has also been here for Inside Out, and when he was still at Wired. You guys are drinking Manhattans? What's this?
No, we actually were having lunch.
Yeah?
And I had collected all of these stories over years of
Right.
people who fake their own death. And it's like, what about this? What about that? What about
And
that?
he's doing the editor's thing. No,
That's not enough.
No.
And then he said, he has a slightly different recollection of it, but I recall that he said something like, well, you can't really get to like the emotional heart of what it feels like. You're not going to get any of these people. These people are all too small time. And so I said, well, why don't I just do it? Why don't I do it myself? And he said, that's the worst fucking idea I've ever heard in my life. He literally, that's what he said. I remember that forever. And he was right, though, because I actually meant, like, what if I fake my own death? Which is like, can you imagine? I'm just, like, for my story, I'm just going to be like,
you have a hard time cashing the check for the story, yeah.
Yeah, and then just reemerge, like, sorry, family.
Right.
I'm alive. Yeah. It's a great story. But I think very quickly, he kind of, like, helped me, or even, like, he was responsible for sort of honing in on the idea of, like, well, you don't have to go all the way. What if it was really about changing your identity, which is really what it was. It was about identity. It wasn't so much about on the grid, off the grid. It was like, what is it like to take on a new identity and try to live under that identity in this day and age? And, you know, how do you live and how do you get away with it? And then we sort of backed into like, well, this is not going to be interesting unless someone's looking for you. So for a while we thought we'd pay someone to look for me, like a PI, and then we kind of, I don't know how, like hit on the idea of a contest. It was like before crowdsourcing or anything was a notion. So it was really sort of, I think it was before that, I don't know. Jeff Howe, the author of Crowdsourcing, might correct me on that. But you know, the idea of sort of like, what if everyone was looking for you and trying to find this person living under a new name? And so we kind of like started honing these rules around it, and we got Wired somewhat miraculously to approve it. I thought for legal reasons they would just say, no, there's no way we're going to do that.
But you sort of got like a puzzle designer involved, yes?
Yeah, that was late on. So that was, there was basically, when we got towards the end of when I was about to leave, fairly close to when I was about to leave, I think, we had all kinds of concerns, one of which was like no one would care.
Yes,
no one would look for me. One of which was people would go crazy looking for me and do illegal things. And then one of them was just that as the time went on, how could we keep it interesting? So we brought in these puzzle designers from Lone Shark Games, which is in Seattle, and they do these these crazy big, they're called ARGs, they're like alternate reality games, like where they put people in weird situations and you have to find things. Anyway, they were sort of brought in to say like, can you structure like a series of challenges if later on in the thing no one can find him, and we'll like make it more interesting for people.
And so how long did you spin this out?
How long did we plan it? Or
Well,
how long,
how
was I
long
out?
did you plan it? But then because I just want to get to this other point. How long were you able to stay off the grid?
26 days.
26 days.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is that a long time?
It felt like a long time. I mean, it was a long time given the restrictions under which I was operating. See, now I still feel like competitive about it in some way. Yeah, it was a long time. It was very difficult.
Yeah.
But we were trying to simulate, if you adopted a new identity and disappeared forever, people would have forever to find you. So if you're going to compress it into this time period, if someone goes off the grid, you're not going to find them in a month. Like, you just go stay in a national park, no one's going to find you. But unless it's like a massive law enforcement effort. So the idea was, Nick had the ability to like dole out information about me, everything that had happened to me before I left, my credit cards, all my email, he had access to everything in my life. And that way you'd get like all of the stuff that would take an investigator months and months and months to uncover, he could just throw at them. So it was supposed to be a sort of compressed version of spending a year trying to find
this
someone.
is an unusually, and it's really worth digging up, even though it's now been a couple of years, just to get a glimpse of just the energy and alacrity with which an engaged reader will pursue the subject of the story. It's really quite remarkable, because it became some fairly creative and maybe even borderline illegal hacking involved in trying to sort of keep after you. But it's an unusually, how shall I say, immersive reporting experience. So I'm wondering, like, as a reporter, how did you keep track of yourself?
Well, the fortunate thing
was,
was,
like, right, okay, now I'm leaving for the motel. Yeah, okay. Now
Yeah.
I'm, what did you do?
The sort of lucky thing from a reporting perspective, was that there was no one to interview, and I had like all day to do nothing a lot of times. So I could like write, I took videos of myself, which actually like recently we re-released a version of the story through our software,
Right.
and like some of the videos are in there. Actually, Olivia, who's here, like edited these hours and hours of video that I took of myself. So sometimes I took videos of myself, which partly I did for reporting purposes, or audio tapes of things. I took notes every day. There was also like a huge online record, so there were thousands of tweets a day. So I would like screenshot and save all those, and like internet relay chat stuff, I would save them all, and I had them all in these folders. So the only difficult time was for a while I like basically hitchhiked across the country with this band, and I was always trying to keep my identity secret from them. So I was sort of, surreptitiously take notes and things.
Well, and not so surreptitiously peeling off $100 bills at gas stations.
Well, yeah, that was a little. They definitely thought there was something weird going on with me, because I posted on Craigslist, or they had posted on Craigslist, that they would give someone a ride for gas money across the country. I was in LA, and so I said, great. I told them that I was like sort of like a film location scout in some sense. I kind of gave them that impression.
Yeah.
And that I had lost my driver's license, so I couldn't rent a car. I was supposed to rent a car and drive, and but they didn't care. They were just sort of like, whatever, if you can pay for gas. But I had all hundreds, because that's the only way to carry around like $3,000 for a month. So every time we stopped for gas, I would just be like, I also had them in this belt. My mom, this is like totally not on topic, but my mom, she's very like paranoid about crime. So she'd give me this belt that had like a zipper pocket on the underside. And I was just like, Mom, why are you giving me this? And it was the most useful thing I've ever had. I had like $3,000 in this belt.
Are you wearing it now?
I'm not wearing it right now.
Okay, I thought I'd check.
It does have money in it in my house in case I ever need to just go.
So you got caught.
Yeah, I got caught in New Orleans.
And then you took your raw material, you took your notes, you took your selfies, and you constructed, with all the help of Wired, a very immersive and proto-atavistic story out of it.
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, the story especially then, I mean, it's not that long ago, but it was like, that was a print story. It was meant for print.
2009. 2009,
Yeah.
sorry, thank you.
So it was written for print, and the web was very much an afterthought, even on that story. So they had all these ideas, like, you know, we'll do a map, and they did like a static map that just kind of like marked everything on it. They didn't use the videos for anything. And, you know, we had some photos, and there were a few things in there, but it was kind of like the germ of the idea of the Atavist actually came from frustration over that, where I thought, this is really, this story, like, it is of the web. Like, people were following it on the web, I was communicating with people, and it should exist in this, like, the design that goes into it should be equivalent to the design that went into the print version, but that just wasn't true at that time.
Now, I should ask, is that because, I mean, because we're talking about Wired. I mean, if you were talking about, like, I don't know, Time Magazine or National Geographic or something more stodgy, you'd say, oh, well, they just don't get it. But of course, Wired was the hopped up, hepped up Bible of that whole world. Was it just like a failure of imagination on Wired's part? Was it because of this funny internal division between Wired and then its online effort at the time, which was, for historical reasons that I don't think anyone can ever figure out, Wired magazine for a long time actually didn't own its own website, and its own digital operation was entirely separate? I mean,
yeah,
was
they
it
had sold it off.
schizophrenia, or they just couldn't see it?
Yeah, no, it was more that. I mean, it was more the kind of like logistical problems that they had at the time, where they had bought it back, I think, at that point. So it was combined.
Ah, okay.
It was like in a different building, and basically like Wired.com was like a daily news site, and they also hosted the magazine. But you sort of had to like ask them to like design something. It wasn't like now it's completely, now they're actually like one, and they're in the same building, and like the editor cares about both. But at the time, it was sort of like, okay, we'll give them the story and see what they can do with it. And they just didn't really have any resources to put together something fancy. Also, all of the things that are happening now were like, if you look at The Verge, or you look at any of these things that are incredibly well designed, that did not exist. That existed in like art projects, but people did not design features with sort of like the digital medium in mind, using like giant images and all these sorts of things. Probably because browsers were slow and all these reasons, but it was like no one really thought of that, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So there you are, frustrated, found, caught, nailed, returned to life, resurrected, but frustrated. You're what, having lunch with Nick Thompson again?
Yeah, actually, he came over to watch the Alabama-Tennessee football game.
Oh, okay. And so, as would naturally happen during the Alabama-Tennessee football game, the conversation turns to, why can't we do immersive reporting on the web?
That's what all the fans are talking. All Alabama fans are talking. Probably Alabama was killing them. I think the game got boring. But yeah, we started talking about, you know, like both that, like why aren't things designed that way, and we were talking about why you couldn't do stories that long. I mean, the story ran like 9,400 words probably, and there was an original companion story that at the beginning was like 4,500. So.
Yeah, and a long Wired story is like 3,500 words.
These days, yeah. I mean, they had done stuff.
Sure.
In the, like, Neil Stephenson did a piece that's amazing. That was probably like 20,000 words in like the late 90s, right before I got there. But yeah, everything had gotten a bit shorter. What used to be the 5,000 word piece was now the 3,500 word piece. All that was happening in the magazine world, and I think I was just complaining because I had also tried to get a Knight Foundation grant years before Vanish, before any of that stuff, to do an online magazine that was all long form. And it got rejected. It was probably a terrible proposal. I didn't know anything about applying for a grant, but I always perceived it was partly rejected because they were sort of like, how could you do this? Because I didn't know web design. And so I said, if I knew a web designer, I would do this right now, which is the kind of thing you should never say to Nick Thompson, because he will say, I know a web designer. Let's do this right now, which is that's basically what happened.
Is that what happened?
Yeah, I said, like, I don't know any of the web
I'm sure on
designers.
that Saturday afternoon, while not everyone was watching the Alabama-Tennessee football game, but that there were a great many journalists across the United States or the English-speaking world or whatever, bitching and complaining and moaning about their stories being cut and the collapse of journalism and the inability to write anything longer than a catalog entry, especially online. And I guess part of what I'm wondering is, okay, so you're having the archetypal, oh God, I can't believe I can't get room for my story conversation, which is endemic. But you two decided that you somehow had license to do something about it. You
Yeah.
felt entitled to take initiative.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, I think it was a combination of it just being fun. I mean, it's the same reason I get into something like PopUp Magazine. Like, at first it's just fun to talk about, what if we did that? And then...
Well, so PopUp Magazine, to
Yeah.
digress, tell us what PopUp Magazine is.
PopUp Magazine
We've
is-
alluded to it a couple of times.
Yeah,
so.
it's basically a live magazine that unfolds on stage, where it's a mix of writers, photographers, filmmakers, radio producers, and it's sort of constructed like a magazine. So there's shorts in the front and features in the back, and each person goes after there's usually 20 or so people. And we started in San Francisco in like 2008, and we do a couple a year, and now it sells out like Symphony Hall, which is 3,000 seats. It'll sell out in like 20 minutes. It's this kind of like only live experience. It's not recorded. There's no photos. You can't find out anything about it if you weren't there. So it's like a magazine that's put on just for the people in the audience, and then it disappears.
And this attracted you for what reason?
It's sort of the
The
same.
disappearance part? I mean, is this...
Well, it's sort of the same. I mean, I could now in hindsight, I could go back and sort of say like, well, I was interested in like, the future of live performance and stuff, but it really wasn't that. It was just like me and a couple of friends saying, readings are boring. Like, book readings are so boring. And you go and it's like you can't believe that the people who have been to readings are now reading in a way that's boring. It's like they've never been to one. And so we thought like, why can't you get together like a bunch of people, creative people, and have them like really tell a story? And not like a moth kind of story, which is also great, but like a nonfiction story like you'd read in a magazine. And then we started talking about it, and then we said, let's do that in a bar. And then it turned into a theater. And then we thought, all right, we'll do one. And then once somebody knew Michael Pollan, so Michael Pollan was on the first roster, so then it sold out. And then it just sort of like turned into a thing that like, it just kept going, and it kept being fun, and so we kept doing it. I think
it's interesting because there is a number of people now are kind of doing journalism as concert tour.
Yeah, now it's a big thing. Tina Brown's she's very into that now.
Tina Brown, the Radio Lab folks.
Yeah, that Radio Lab show.
In the NPR radio people, the American Life folks, whatever. Was this for you though, I mean, an immersive way to tell a story, or was this just something like, oh, hey, me and my friends, we're drinking Manhattans again, so we're having ideas. I just want to...
I mean, I'd like to say it was the former. I mean, there's all these things in it that I think we did because we were smart about how we came up with it. Like, we in some sense recognized that people were looking for a live experience because we spend all day online, because everything is recorded, because you're inundated with sort of like, information all day, that it might be nice to go to a thing where something just washes over you and you can experience the stories, and then you go out to a party afterwards and talk about them. That's a part of it. There's always a big party at the end, and all the performers are there too. And so, it was like we were aware of that kind of stuff, but honestly, it wasn't that we sat down and said like, this could be huge because the trends are pointing in this direction. It was just sort of like, wow, wouldn't it be fun to have a whole bunch of people together, one of whom is Michael Pollan, and one of whom is like, an Academy Award-winning documentary filmmaker, and one of whom is a producer at This American Life, and they're all doing stories on stage. It's like, I would go to that, so I'd love to be a part of it.
So, would take you back to lunch with Nick, and you are deciding, oh, wouldn't this be fun if we designed a long-form narrative nonfiction mobile multi-platform publishing system. That's a nice way to spend the afternoon while watching the Alabama-Tennessee football game. Now, I'm just kind of curious. I want to understand a little bit. You've said this in a couple of different ways now with cold calling Wired, deciding to do that vanished story as an immersive performance piece. Your interest in being an impresario with PopUp Magazine, which is about the same time. I mean, these are you're stepping out, I don't know how else to put it, in ways that many journalists normally don't. We're all behind the curtain types. What gave you your initiative? Starting up a new business. We've had several people here this fall. It's been kind of our theme. David Sassoon, Inside Climate News, who we're very happy to have in the audience here this evening, started up a website because he had a specific story that he wanted people to hear. He had a specific coverage area. That pushed him, as best I can tell. And he's here and he's free to contradict me. Jim Glick, who early in his career stepped out of being a technology writer and an author and started up an internet company. As it turned out, a very lucrative one, but in part because he wanted to be part of the technological information revolution that he had been covering. He wanted to be a participant. What's with you?
Well, I think it's partly that I was a freelancer for a long time, so I was sort of used to existing outside of institutions and feeling like I had to like keep my little legs in motion or nothing would happen. Like no paychecks come in. You can't just sort of like sit there and let your job happen to you. That's sort of like the horrible and wonderful thing about being a freelancer. But I think it was also like I just didn't come from the world. I didn't come from the media journalism world either. I didn't feel like I did. I always had like a little bit of a chip on my shoulder because I felt like I didn't go to journalism school and I didn't know anyone in media, and that I got lucky in even getting that internship, and that I had to like prove to everyone that I could do it. But at the same time, I didn't feel bound by any career path or anything. It was sort of like, just almost like ridiculous that people pay me to like go to Brazil and do a story. I just thought like, that's insane. Like, why? I don't even know why they're doing this, but I'll just ride it out. So I think I just didn't feel beholden necessarily to like going in one direction or another. And then, I don't know, beyond that, it could be like a little bit genetic because my father was an entrepreneur and my grandfather was an entrepreneur, although in a hilariously terrible way. So I don't know, not genetic, but sort of like, maybe your family instills in you this idea that it's okay for you to go out and try, and it's okay if you fail and all that sort of stuff.
It's okay if you fail.
Yeah, my grandfather failed. One time we tabulated, it was like 23 different businesses he tried to start and failed.
That sort of implies that the 24th succeeded.
Sort of. The 24th was a used furniture store, which like lasted for a long time.
Okay.
Like he mostly made a living on it.
So, The Atavist. It's two things. It's a kind of publication. I mean, you commission stories, you edit them, you put them together, you and your staff.
Yeah, mostly them.
Mostly them.
Actually.
But it's also, an underlying publishing platform that you've come up with. So can you just tell us a little bit about that? And then I think it would be nice if you don't mind firing up the Mac here. Maybe show us a little bit of what we're talking about. Because I'm very curious about how this worked for you. Because I get the sense that the underlying software, the underlying publishing platform is kind of taking over you.
Me personally?
You personally.
Yeah, in some ways, or just like the business aspects of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it came about because we had all these ideas, so we started meeting. So the like web designer in question that Nick was talking about was this guy Jefferson Rabb, who is a genius.
Very smart guy.
And he fortunately was interested in the idea. I mean, he'd been doing book websites, so he was already the kind of programmer who loves to read and loves culture and music, and he's very engaged in the world. And so he started building sort of prototypes for what we wanted to do, app for the phone and then an app for the iPad, and built the website and started building ebooks because we were going to sell ebooks as well. And at a certain point, he just decided that it would be easier rather than adding each feature to each one every time, which I kept asking him, like, what if we did an audiobook that was included in the thing? And he would say, okay, I can do that. Like, what if he created some underlying platform that basically, where I could do that stuff, where he could create the opportunity for me, a content management system is the technical term for it, where it could house everything and I could work with it, and then he would worry about, what the outputs that created, where they would go. And so that's how it came about. And then, we probably, I don't know if we would have done anything with it, except we had this interaction with, which I've talked about many times. This guy, I hope someday he hears this, but this venture capitalist that we were introduced to, who was the only person we went to when we were sort of like, let's raise some money.
Yes, you had to raise money. Right.
And he basically laughed in our face. He said, like, you're starting a magazine of long journalism. Like, he was not interested in this at all, but he did ask sort of like, well, how did you make this thing? And I think he assumed that we would say, like, Jefferson made it. And Jefferson sort of like opened up the software and was like, well, we put this here and then you click this and then it's all published. And he said, quit what you're doing, don't do any stupid magazine, take the software, go make a bunch of money, and then you can do as many magazines as you want. And we were really mad about it. We were sort of like, I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on this thing much.
Oh,
I already
go
did,
right
I
ahead.
guess.
Go right ahead.
We were sort of like, fuck that guy. He can keep his money. Like, again, it was like we weren't in it for, to create like an institution. We were sort of like, or to make money. We were just sort of like, no, we wanted to publish some stories. And so if this guy doesn't want to be a part of that, we don't want anything to do with him. But then, he was business-wise smarter than us. So it planted this seed in our head, like, no, actually that's worth some money. That guy, he must be onto something. So when we launched, we very much had it in mind that we would mention it every time we were covered in the press, that I would talk to people about it.
This is, so the site, the publication is the Atavist.
Right, so the publication.
And the publishing system is the Creativist, correct?
Right.
So while you're booting this up, tell us where the word Atavist came from. Where did you get that title?
Atavist, well, should I tell you the real reason or like the one that I tell
Well,
everyone?
normally I like it when you all lie to us, but in your case, I'm going to make an exception and ask for the truth.
So the real reason is that atavistic is a word that Hunter Thompson uses a lot in his journalism. And I got really, into that word just because like I loved all that work, especially in his letters. If you read like the collection of letters, you'll find it in a bunch of places. And it like perfectly encapsulated this view that he had of like what was happening to America. It was just like an atavistic wave was pouring over of like corporate, greedy corporate losers.
But it's a word of regression, yes?
Yeah, so it's sort of like, regression. It can mean sort of like technically, biologically, a trait that is lost in a lineage that, reemerges, like a whale that's born with like leg bones because whales used to be on land, or a human that's born with like a tail, that kind of thing. But it also can mean something darker, which is sort of, violent impulses of humans that come to the surface. So that's kind of like, that's the sense in which I think he was using it.
Right.
But anyway, so when I set up my personal website, I got the domain Atavist. I had Atavistic, and I had atavist.net at the time. And so that was my personal website. So when we went to name the company and the publication, we went through like hundreds, if you've ever named like a band or anything, it's like the same thing where you're like, what about this? What about that? And Jeff even made an app that you could like shake the phone and it would just like twirl through all the names we had come up with. And then in the end, we just ended up back at Atavist because I owned the domain, and it was sort of like, it has an interesting meaning, which is now, this is sort of like the meaning of it, which is like an old type of storytelling that like reemerges in the digital age. But that was really sort of like an afterthought. We own the domain.
3 answers, all of them true. Thank you. So, fire this up. So I think at the moment there are 32, I think I counted the other day, narratives up here.
Something like that. Yeah.
They range from like, 9,000 words on up?
5,000 to 30,000. But most of them come in We rarely have one that's less than 10. We've had a couple that are less than 10, but mostly they usually sit in the 10 to 20 range, and then we've had one that's 29 and a couple that are 22 to 25.
And you commission these, you get pitched?
Yep, we get pitched. We will farm some stories out that we come up with in-house. I would say 90% of those stories were pitched to us. Should I show one? Is that the?
If you just, I think for those of us who have not had an opportunity to visit the site, it might be handy to just give us a flavor of what you're doing.
All right, here, I'll show this one because it's fun.
I mean, it's interesting while you're doing this. I mean, this is all taking place at a time when large legacy media organizations like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are spending unknown quantities of money, but certainly long periods of time. Snowfall, many of you may be aware of, wonderfully interactive, immersive piece that won a Pulitzer last year. This past week or two, the Journal has trotted out a long-form 10,000 word piece called The Trials that is in the same tradition, very immersive, lots of moving parts, lots of embedded videos and shaky things and animations and all kinds of stuff that are designed to sort of suck a reader in. But these take months and months of a big team. This is sort of big journalism doing big new media things. One of the things that's quite striking about your effort, and then there's another group that's actually in trouble with the New York Times right now, for doing those big media, big immersive efforts very quickly, very easily.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say on that front, like a lot of that stuff, I mean, we were doing these sort of multimedia stories from the beginning, but we were doing them in apps.
Scroll kit is what I was thinking.
Scroll kit, yeah. So they're also
not, I think, at the same sophistication, but
well, I don't know, they're good.
Yeah, but they're fast. You can do it in an hour.
Yeah, I mean, I think the funny thing is that this stuff originated really. I mean, we were doing some of it, and then places like that were a little more off the beaten path, like Pitchfork was one of the first places that was doing a lot of stuff, and The Verge, when they started, they were doing it, and then like ESPN did a big one, and we were all sitting around trying to figure out how to explain to people what it is we were talking about, like multimedia publishing, and that has a bad connotation going back to the late 90s.
Yeah, that sounds very 1990s.
Yeah, it's very like, people always say like, isn't it just like CD-ROMs? And it's like, you've never used a CD-ROM if you think this is like CD. I use CD-ROMs, and CD-ROMs are a pain in the ass.
Isn't this like CompuServe?
Yeah, exactly, Prodigy. And then the Times did Snowfall, which I think, initially we and other people who had been doing this stuff found like quite annoying, because like now everyone's talking about this stuff, and that's what we had been doing. And it's sort of like the Times has invented this thing. But I think, on a bit of reflection, the positive thing is it actually gave people a language with which to talk about this stuff. Now it's gotten really annoying because it's sort of like, someone would look at this and be like, it's like Bones Fall or whatever.
Oh,
like it's like
nice.
Watergate or something, like where they put gate on everything. So that's irritating, but it is nice that there's a sort of idea out there, and it did encapsulate a lot of those ideas. And I thought, not everyone likes it, but I actually thought it was really, really well done. I think the Times has done even better stuff since then. But it kind of gave people a language to talk about it, and it's really helped us in many ways, because people will come to us and say, literally like, we want a Snowfall, So we're kind of like, yeah, instead of having a bunch of designers and developers, like we can do that in, a week or less.
So show us.
So this is David Kushner's story. It came out a couple of months ago. It's about a reform school in Florida that had basically a legacy of 100 years of abuse of its students, and then these alumni got together and kind of like fought to have it uncovered. And this is abuse at the level of students being murdered and buried in unmarked graves on the campus. So, it's got sort of like huge images. It's got a little bit of video. It's not big on video, but it has a kind of atmospheric video in it. That's one of the actual graveyards on the campus of the school. And then this one's actually like it's got a soundtrack.
Soundtrack, nice.
This one's very judiciously linked, so I have a hard time finding one. But one of the things we do is we try to layer in a lot of both sort of like the information that the reporter digs up that doesn't end up in the story, but also ways for people to orient themselves. I should have had Olivia do this. She knows where they all are. There we go. Orient themselves in the story. So, characters, timelines, maps, things that you would find. The original idea was like things that you would find in a. This is giving this whole talk like a different mood.
I'm going to start crying in a minute.
Things that you would find like in a book, in the center of the book, or at the beginning of the book or the end, like a map that you would flip to try to orient yourself in the story, that those things could be brought into the story and made one experience. And that you would not have to leave the piece in order to find those. And it applies in different ways over different stories. So a story with a lot of music, the idea was to put soundtracks in, to put clips of music in the way that, at least if I read like an Alex Ross piece or something like that, like I find myself in a different tab Googling music and things like that. So,
Evan, can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
I'm turning this off. One of the things that I'm wondering is whether, people like Dave Kushner, he's an adjunct here at NYU. He's been writing books and magazine pieces for a long time. He's great. Does he essentially change his style, or does he just augment his storytelling with all these fun little atmospherics? And have you found now that as people have become more accustomed to the package, that they're actually changing the text, the textual aspects of storytelling? And if so, how has it changed?
I would say that it's a range. And in a lot of cases, we're still in a situation where, and I think I'll say for good reason, where the writer just writes their story. They go out and report the story, they write the story. We have producers on staff, like Olivia, we have another producer named Gray, who understand the way the software works and also understand how to put together these stories, who will then take the raw text and hopefully, in the best scenario, in consultation with the writer, figure out how it's going to be designed and what we're going to use. So I'd say in most cases, it's more akin to magazine design right now than it is to the writer sort of saying, here's where I want everything to go. Now, there are writers that do that. I mean, we did this story called Finding Shakespeare that was a guy named Daniel Franzen, who's a young writer who works at the New Yorker, and he really had thought a lot about how video played into his story. So we had meetings from very early on with Olivia, with other people on staff saying, okay, this is how we want to use this stuff. So I think, it's partly a generational thing. I think people who are educated here are more comfortable with different, working in different mediums at the same time. I think that's part of it. But it's also true that it's really hard to go out and report a 20,000 word story. And so you want to be a little bit careful that you're not tasking people with doing something that's not their expertise. Like David Kushner is a wonderful reporter and writer. I don't necessarily want David Kushner like also trying to shoot video while he's like reporting this reform school story. I think that would be a mistake. So we're still trying to sort of like work within the parameters of what people can do.
But if Dave knew from the beginning that this was going to be in a creativist package where there would be video or whatever, theoretically, I think it would be hard after all these years, speaking personally, of telling stories that, where you basically think about these extra things as extras, not as inherent, not as core to the storytelling, but as just sort of add-ons, wonderful add-ons. In the print days, we would just say, well, that's what a photo is, or that's what an infographic is. But theoretically, somebody like Dave, he's not here, I don't think, but he's interested in what's happening in journalism now. Theoretically, he could actually change his mode of storytelling, knowing that.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
I'm wondering, to what extent that's actually happening. It sounds like
It
is
has
starting to
happened.
happen, but
Yeah.
it's kind of a slow process.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on how invested someone is and where the story comes from and what the situation is around it. I mean, I've written the story for us, one of our first stories, that it really was planned around a piece of video. Like, I structured the story so that the video could be the lead. That was the whole idea. And we've had a couple of cases that are like that. I think we're sort of trying to do that also in the confines of like trying to put out an enormous story every month. And so sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes, we don't feel like this stuff has to be in every piece. Like every piece doesn't have to have video. Some pieces don't need video, and some pieces are much more spare. Like this one has very few extras laid into it. It's really mostly about the text and the images and a little bit of video. But some of them are very populated with extras because there's just a lot of stuff that you can bring into the story to make it come alive a bit more.
Let me follow up on that and flip the question. So in some ways, I could look at this and say, oh, well, this is all very interesting, but, people were doing things like this back in the old days in 2000. But it was all oriented toward desktops. It was all oriented toward you were sitting there and you were staring at something and maybe you were clicking on it, but mostly it was just washing over you. This is designed for mobile apps. This is designed for things that you touch. I wonder if you have thoughts about how that changes it for the reader.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think that's what prompted the sort of, resurgence in a lot of this type of work, even this length of work, is the tablet world, is the phone world, the world of reading on the device that's in your hands. I mean, that's what makes it different from a CD-ROM where you're sitting there being like, now I click menu 4.
Right.
Like, it's different to experience something where you are tapping, where you're moving through the story in a physical way. And in that sense, I do feel like it's new. The interesting thing is like how much of this is happening on the web that people are looking at in their browsers while they sit at their desk as well. Like, that's what I think is really surprising, is like, we thought this would all be tablet stuff, and actually like a lot of it is on the web. Now, if it's done well, and I think one of the bigger complaints about a lot of these stories is that they're not done well because they don't look good when you actually look at them on your phone. So ours are, hopefully people can tell us if they're not, but like they're actually designed to be also read on the phone. So they redesign when you look at them on the phone.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to an answer to your question, Dan. Evan, your platform gives a small institution like ours great powers. So the New York Times can go and do Snowfall, but it cost them a fortune and a lot of staff time. And we've licensed your software, and it allows us to do multimedia stories. And it's not so much the writers that are thinking differently, it's the editors who are thinking differently. And we're involved in some collaborations where we know that one of our partners is going to be doing the video, and we know another partner is going to be doing the data, and so on. And so it allows for us to collaborate around the platform that's really powerful. Two questions I have, if you don't mind. One is the Bones of Mariana. I haven't read it, and it's the first I heard of it. What impact did it have? Number one. That's my first question, because this is a problem we have as a small outfit. That sounds like a blockbuster story. The other question is like a bigger one about what your thoughts are about how what you're doing is changing the face of the way we think of journalism. You're probably going to get to that, Lee, yourself, but it's a question we're tasked with also.
Yeah, I think the first one is a really good question. I think we spend a lot of time thinking about it and talking about it. I mean, because we have since our beginning, lived in the world of paid media, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's basically books. It's difficult to have the kind of impact that you can have with a free story. Now, I think there are all these sorts of trade-offs in that. Like, you're going for a smaller audience that's paying to support the work. It's a clear model to me for compensation for the writer, because we can give them, you know, half of everything we make. But we struggle with that, you know, because we get some, I think we've published some really, really powerful journalism. And so, you know, we have a person who runs marketing for us who, you know, will try to get people on NPR, we'll try to get them on television. I mean, this story is 2 months old, but they're still, you know, negotiating with, like, you know, Good Morning America or something, and, you know, local TV stations in Florida to, like, get the story out and figure out, you know, there's some scoops in here, like, how do we get those out? So, you know, we do promotional efforts, and we will often do excerpts as a way to just, like, get the story into the world so the writer can have a little bit of both. So if we get an excerpt on The Atlantic, you know, if there's news in it, or, you know, there's some part of it that the writer just wants a lot of people's eyeballs on, we can do that. And then hopefully that drives people to buy. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Like the Huffington Post once drove like crazy buyers to us, like put on the bestseller list. But then sometimes it'll be on a huge outlet and then no one will buy it and you don't know why. So it's definitely a struggle. I mean, I think we are constantly thinking about it, we're constantly reevaluating it, whether or not, you know, we did a story that we had a sponsor buy out basically a month's worth of reads and we made it free, the story Coronado High, and, you know, just to see what kind of traffic it would get and see, you know, is that a model that we could use for some stories or all stories, you know?
So share some traffic numbers if you don't mind. What's a
pretty
success
cagey
for you?
about that. I mean, a success for us in sale, like a crazy success for us in sales is like 50,000 copies sold. But that's like,
copies.
you know, that's like, in our world, that's like a runaway bestseller, you know?
That's true in Amazon too, you should know that, the ebooks.
Yeah,
They
Yeah.
sell 5,000 or 10,000 ebooks.
yeah.
Do you still have that microphone?
No.
All right, no, okay, no, it's fine. No, go ahead, David, go ahead.
So, you know, 50,000 is a bestseller.
Yeah.
Amazon, if they sell 5, they're happy.
Yeah.
Right.
And I mean, so, you know, then there's a whole range. So, you know, in there, you've got ones that are selling, you know, we would be happy if none of them sold 50,000, but they all sold 15. Like that would be, you know, that's like the mid-list dream, is that everything
Right.
sells 15.
I mean, I know that that's not just something that, well, for the purposes of this conversation, I'll call smaller, energetic outlets have to struggle with. I mean, I know that the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, who can get huge amounts of traffic in terms of clicks or unique views or whatever. I mean, Trials is getting hundreds of thousands of hits, but translating that into ebook sales or into the kind of thing that you're doing with the long reads, the Kindle singles, that's a whole different leap, and that's one we haven't figured out yet either. In fact, this is what things like Trials and things like Snowfall are in part experiments to figure that out.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is experimental. And I think we still view, you know, it's funny because we sort of get held up as this, like, the model, and then, like, a bunch of people sort of, like, followed on and, like, adopted our model. But, you know, all I care about is publishing great stories and paying the writers. So we actually don't care about being the model or representing some future of journalism, anything. So if we find something else that pays the writers as well, and we can do the same quality stories, we probably do it. So, you know, I think it really works sometimes, and so we like the paid model because it's very, the confines of it all make sense, and it's sort of like everyone knows what they're doing, and you know where the money's coming from, and you know how you're going to support the writer. But, you know, when we did a sponsored story, probably, you know, 65, 70,000 people came and read it. So, I mean, they didn't all read it, but, you know, came to it.
Got
which is, like,
engaged.
yeah,
in
and that's
a long form narrative.
that's
a
a
lot
site
of
that, you know, we don't have any traffic. Like, we don't drive traffic to our site, really, because we don't publish free content of any type. So, you know, in some ways, like, that's pretty remarkable too. So I feel like there's a lot of people doing this stuff, and there's all sorts of models of various flavors, and we feel like we're also still in an experimental mode in some ways.
To sort of follow up on David's second and more profound question, I mean, at least from where I think people like me sit, what's striking about the Atavist and Creativist in particular is that it's absolutely true that you know, big media can spend big bucks and spend big amounts of time putting these things out, and that's always been how we've been able to keep our hands on the megaphone, you know, because we're big and we can hold it with both hands and we can afford the megaphone. What's so interesting about this is that it is free as a single practitioner.
Yeah, you can use
it's
it for free.
It's light-footed, and it embodies a set of design tools that actually make it all very simple. So it's a real leveler, it seems to me.
That's yeah. I mean, that's the idea.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of a piece with blogging was sort of the first version of this, and now where you sort of like, oh, I can start my own blog and have my own voice and have my own platform, and it can also get huge in some cases, although that's only the 0.001%. But this is saying you can give these same tools that you can build either a whole publication or a highly designed story or series of stories, and actually distribute them the same way that a big media company distributes them. Yeah, I think we want small publishers to use it to sort of like, we don't even care if they're competitive to us. I mean, if they're the next Atavist.
It being the underlying publishing software.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Because then it's just more long form. That's great. Good.
Hi. I have a question as a freelancer who sort of makes multimedia stuff but is also interested in long-form narrative. And my question is, you've mentioned that you don't want people who are like all-star reporters worrying about video when they're out reporting. But when you look at pitches, are you looking for people to pitch you things that involve multimedia, or do you not care? Are you just thinking it's really, how do you know that it's an Atavist story versus just a great long story?
well, the last part, how do we know it's an Atavist story, is that sort of like witchcraft that like every magazine has, where Wired used to do this all the time, where you'd pitch a story and they'd be like, it's not really Wired. And you're like, you did a story just like this before. And they're like, yeah, but it's not quite Wired. And it's just a thing that people say. So we say like, it's not quite narrative enough. That's usually what we say. So there's a little bit of uncertainty around what that really means. But in terms of the multimedia, I would love it if every pitch came with like a defined idea of how it would be, what the basic elements that you could get. It doesn't have to be like, it's gonna be this, that, and the other, but sort of like, here's what we could gather. Here's what I think I can find. I think that would be useful. In some sense, you can't overthink it, because then it would be like saying, here's my magazine story and how it will be designed in your magazine. Like, no, the designers and producers are going to put it together, but we get a lot of stories that are just standard story pitches, and frankly, they've probably been at the New Yorker or they've been somewhere else, and they're magazine writers, like they're trying to find a home for something, especially stuff that doesn't have a news peg, especially stuff that's heavily narrative and characters. There's not a lot of room for that, or that's long. So for those, like, we'll try to figure out what the other end of it is. But I think more and more we're starting to get people pitching stuff. I actually thought, and this is the one thing that I feel like is missing, I thought people were going to pitch us a million, vanishes, like a million, like, contests with people doing this, that, and the other, and then we'll pull them in a Twitter stream and do this. Nobody pitches those stories. So
Now,
if there's one thing we would like, it's sort of like, I have an idea of like doing something completely different that's profoundly digital.
See, this is interesting. This is going to bring our conversation back around. I'm surprised, now I've heard it twice in two different knowledgeable people out here, that as part of the reporting process in 2013, from the get-go, the reporter is not thinking about video, is not thinking about sound, is not thinking about visuals. Because I can tell you, every single story we do at the Wall Street Journal, that's part of the initial conversation. I come, even on news, I come to my editor and I say, okay, this is it, this paper's coming out, or this is happening, this news media story, here's what I can get here. I think it's going to be really good because, well, we can get our video people to do that. It's just part of the conversation. And you all are being trained to do that.
Yeah.
And it's, in 2013, we shouldn't be talking about it that way. I just have to say that. All of these are part of your, what do you want to call it, your palette, your toolkit. You've got one of those funny mechanical pencils that if you turn it this way, a red one comes out, and you turn it that way, and a blue one comes out. Every story has to have those components, whether you end up using them or not in final publication. I mean,
I mostly agree with that. But I think
I'm just telling you how it works at my level. I mean,
but it
that's
depends
just what
on
they do.
What kind of journalism we're doing. Like, if you look at this Bones of Mariana, I mean, this photo, which is this browser too small to see it, too small to really see it, but like, if we're trying to create something that we feel is a beautiful and moving package of a story, and like I've never seen David Kushner's photographs. Like, he might be a wonderful photographer, but I'd be very surprised if he could take a portrait like that.
That's not my point. My point is, of course, you've got to have raw material in which to carry out your beautiful design.
Yeah.
And your reporter is in charge of being the fount of beautiful material. Hey, you know what? There's this amazing guy, the main character, you should see him. The school where these people were buried, it's amazing. It's got Spanish moss going down.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, I'm just saying that these are
they have
things
to help
that
you find it. But
you don't
we hired a
necessarily
photographer
have to
for
be
that.
the. Yeah, of course
Yeah.
you would.
Yeah.
You got to say, our thinking is, and we might be wrong, I'd be interested to hear what Evan has to say about this, but our thinking is that even if our graduates never actually build a data viz or never actually shoot video, and many of them actually do both those things, but say they didn't, the process of understanding how to do that and what it takes and what works and what doesn't work, even if they're not particularly good at it, even if they can't do it as well as they can tell a story in text, is somehow gives them the potential to be more successful, to be better storytellers.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
that I completely
I wonder if
agree
that. Are you sure though? I mean,
Yeah, no,
you know,
I agree with
don't
that.
just tell me what I want to hear on that.
No, I agree with that.
No, he
I
wants
mean,
to tell you what I want to hear.
what do you guys want to hear? No, that part I agree with. I mean, it's the same thing with like learning to code. There's all this really just journalists learn to code and whatever. But I mean, as important as it might be, there's certain jobs. I mean, we have jobs where like learning to code is very important. But I think understanding how things work, like that's actually like almost part of why we started the Atavist. It's just sort of to like participate in this world that seems like it's like steamrolling you. And actually, if you understand it, you can at least participate in the process of changing it, and rather than letting it happen to you. And I think the same is true, just understanding like what does it take to do something like parallax scrolling? Like you can say like, I saw that on Snowfall, like we'd like to have that. But if you don't know anything about coding, you gotta, even if you have a programmer right there, you can't even speak the same language about how long it's gonna take. So I think it is very useful to be able to communicate with people in the same way that if you're going to choose photos as a producer, you know, understanding the rule of thirds is like a useful thing to do, even if you're not a great photographer. Like developing an eye and an ear, and you know, in our case, people, like we have a guy named Gray Beltran who went to journalism school, and turns out like he didn't even train in design, but he's like a great cover designer, he's a great story designer. But he knew some CSS, he learned CSS in school, and now he's taken that to designing these stories. So, you know, in our case, like it's extreme, those skills are useful. But I think for journalists in general, I literally just mean like for long form stories, it's very hard for me to see. You need to be really amazing in all of these if you're going to go out and like shoot and report and photograph and take audio and come back with like a great 10,000 word story. I think that's just like really, really, really hard to do.
Well, there's a lot of tuition that's gone into that, so I'm glad to hear it. Can I ask you a rude question?
Lewd?
Yeah, rude.
Oh.
Lewd would be good though.
Lewd would be better, but no, I can't go there. No, rude about money.
We're going there.
Yeah,
Good. No,
I'm
want
sorry,
to-
Lee. I don't want to.
No, that's the next topic. This is good.
Okay, great.
This is good.
I sense that you were headed that direction. You know, what are writers really making for a piece in the Atavist? And are you at the point yet where somebody like Dave, for example, you said that a lot of the pitches you see, you think have gone elsewhere too. Maybe they've gone to the New Yorker or the Times Magazine or the Atlantic, whatever. Are you at the point yet where you can deliver financially for these writers the way that traditional outlet delivers, or are you not there yet?
No, let's break that down. That's a very good question, and that was the next place we're going. So, revenues.
Yeah.
Dollars. I come to you as a writer. We're revenue sharing. One of the things I thought was very interesting about your early experience with Vanished, I seem to recall that when we were talking about it, you told me that as part of this project with Wired, you actually put $3,000 of your own money into it.
Yep.
And I don't know if that was just because you felt you needed to have something in the game to keep you interested,
yeah,
or
so
what?
I would feel like it, I didn't want to get caught for other reasons.
But there's kind of a cost-sharing, revenue-sharing instinct there. So I come to you, I pitch you a suitably long-form, immersive story. I'm a graduate of NYU, so I'm totally attuned to video and code and the interactives, and I have the enough sense of raw material to get you intrigued visually that you've got stuff for your designers to work with. All right, so how do we cut our deal? How does it work? Is it
So
per word,
no,
per
we don't.
sale,
We don't
per-
care about word
how does it
word
work?
lengths and word rates at all. So what we do is we pay a fee. It's like a magazine
what?
fee.
Like what?
It's usually $5,000.
Okay.
It can go up or down depending on the writer, depending on the story, but that's usually where we start.
That's upfront or on delivery?
It's well, see, now this is being recorded, so
That's
we
right,
give away all
yeah.
the secrets. It's on delivery.
Okay.
Now it is true that if a writer like contacts me and says like I'm going to the Sudan and like I don't want to put $1,000 ticket on my credit card or $2,000 ticket on my credit card, can you advance me that? I will often do that, but yeah, it's on delivery. But literally we pay on time. That's one good thing about a place that's run by writers. Like we pay, when the thing goes up, like their payment goes out, period. But anyway, it's $5,000 and then it's 50% of the net. So it's 50% of the revenues that come to us. Every dollar that comes to us, 50 cents goes to the writer.
And how do you set pricing for the piece so that?
Well, we were pricing them at $1.99 and $2.99. So $2.99 for the high-end multimedia version, $1.99 for a text version that we were selling on Kindle and Nook and these other ebook stores. We're kind of testing the like price elasticity situation. So now it's like $2.99 and $3.99. But we set the price.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I, the writer, I deliver, I get, for the sake of discussion, the 5,000.
Yep.
And then explain to me slowly how the revenue sharing works. So at $3.99, I get 99 cents.
So $3.99. Well, it's easier to think about $2.99. So $2.99. If it's Apple, let's say, they take 30%, so they take $1. There's $2 left. We split it. So you get $1 per sale.
Okay.
So if I'm an established freelancer, then you're not quite yet at the Wire, New Yorker.
Well, it depends on how many you sell. I mean, it's a bit like saying, like, how much money are people making writing books these days? You know, it's the same. It's exactly the same. Like, if somebody, sells.
Yeah, I was
Well,
just going to.
see, there you
Dan's
go.
a bad example because.
I mean, if you get a $5,000 advance and then you sell 10,000 copies, the average you're going to make on those, depending on the price, is like, let's say $1. So you've made 15 grand. Now, if you get a 5,000 word assignment, which is like a pretty long assignment to get these days,
Sure.
if you can get $3 a word out of a magazine, great. But that means you're like a pretty accomplished freelancer. So a lot of people will give you $2 a word at a glossy magazine. And so for a 5,000 word piece, again, a hard assignment to get, you're making 10 grand. So, but that's not to say that everybody sells 10,000 copies. I mean, there's plenty of examples of people that have sold 1,500 copies or 2,000 copies who also spent, part of their fee, because we don't do expenses. So expenses come out of it. So they spent $3,000 to go report the shit out of the thing. And so they ended up making like a few grand. So it's a risk, it's a calculated situation. We definitely would never say to someone, especially someone like David Kushner who writes for like Vanity Fair and stuff, we'd never say, you're gonna make Vanity Fair rates or you're gonna make New York Times Magazine rates. We say, here's the deal, fully transparent, you're gonna make $1 off of every one of these that comes in. So like, let's sell as many as we can. And if we don't, we'll all be sad. I mean, especially us.
Well, yeah, you're sharing the risk. You're sharing the risk, which in an odd way, journalists who are great risk takers in many forms are shy, risk averse in others, and often are risk averse in a business sense. So how many of these will you commission a year?
We run 12 a year basically. So, probably commission like that and half again, maybe 20. Something like that we have floating around at any one time. We've started assigning a little more liberally at the beginning. I don't like to kill pieces. And we're not in a financial situation where we can just overassign like crazy and kill pieces like New York Magazine or something like that. So, but then we've had a lot of problems with people not delivering on time, and then we have a hole and we're sort of like desperately trying to dig up a story. So Now we assign a little bit more liberally than we used to.
Well, we got a question in the back, if we can.
Yeah.
All right, and then over here.
Hello. I just have a comment really quickly, and I'll ask the question. But you essentially have pulled like a third of the New Yorker, a third of the Nate Silver, and a third of like the Forbes model, and like put them all together. And it's just pay per page views, the personal franchise, and like just paying per word, which has been interesting. But my question goes back a little bit. I want to preface this by saying I know we're in a very like meta journalism audience, but the thing I think talking about all the stuff about the multimedia and even Snowfall is I think Alexis Madrigal from New Yorker tweeted like 3 weeks ago. He's like, all this Snowfall stuff is great, but I'm not actually reading it. I'm just like scrolling through and like seeing what's interesting. And I found myself recently doing something similar. And I'm wondering, we've come a long way in design of where design now for journalism is actually focused on the reader, and that opposed to this stuff like this is actually making the reading experience easier than just trying to get us to click on things. But I'm just wondering like where this comes into balance of like are people actually what is your focus on people actually consuming these things and reading them opposed to just scrolling through them, or opposed because getting the writer paid is a very big thing, but the
main thing.
It's the only thing. No, it's I think that's a really good question.
Yeah.
The really quick, just like the stuff like the video, I almost feel like it's not being approached in terms of what is this adding, opposed to it's being like what is extra, or like this stuff is natural, let it go in, and if it's not, just like why are we not? Then there's no reason to talk about it. I'm just wondering, it's early, Snowfall, all this stuff, it's almost commoditized, but like where does it start to come back of just natural, like for the story, for the reader, and letting them consume that?
Yeah, I mean,
are you overwhelming the story?
I think it's a great question. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest questions in all this. I will say, I mean, all due respect to Alexis, who's a friend of mine, and I love him, and I think he's a wonderful writer, but I think that attitude, I mean, first of all, journalists bragging about not reading stuff is like a funny pose. I mean, it's very common now. Like, I didn't even read that. It's like, okay, you're a journalist, like, read it. But I do think that there's a kind of bullshit element of that, which is, like, if you pick up a magazine, you could just as easily say, I pick up Wired magazine, which is very highly designed, and be like, why are all these pictures in here? Like, these pictures just interrupting. There's like a sidebar, and now I'm supposed to look over here and like look at the sidebar and then like look back at the text, and like that just means like the story didn't interest you. And then people will say like, well, that Snowfall wasn't even well written. Like, it's just bullshit. It's like a bunch of people, people are always trying to find an angle why something like that people are hyping up can be deflated, and I value that too. But I do think it's just design. Like, it is applying design to storytelling. And that can include video, and I think you're totally right that like, if you're just like, we're gonna drop in a video here, or we're gonna drop in a video there, like you're just, in the same way that in a magazine, you're just sort of like, let's just put photos everywhere. Like, if you're not thinking about the reading experience, you're not really designing it. So our idea is that it can be designed in a way that you would read, you'd be really gross in the story, and then you would see a video and you'd be like, oh wow, here's the actual person in the story, or here's the actual footage, now I'm gonna watch this, and then continue. Like, I think people do that, and I think theoretically it can be done really well, and then you see a crappy example and you're kind of like, look at this mess. Like, they just threw a bunch of shit in here and it's not even readable. But I think that the principle of it is not only just at the beginning, but it's also like a sound principle. Like, it is a sound principle that you can do multimedia experiences that are great stories that people will like better than just reading the story. Will be a different experience of it. And that's the reason why every magazine is not the New Yorker. Like, the New Yorker also has wonderful photography, but mostly exists on like, these are the best stories around, edited by the best editors, and they don't need anything else. And most magazines aren't like that, and I personally love magazines, I love magazine stories. So I just think it's a different approach, and it's not, you can't take one that you don't like and then sort of say like, well, what's the point of this stuff? Nobody reads it.
Did you get a mic?
Hi, I actually have two questions, but my first one is, you were talking earlier about how writers get paid per how many people purchase the article, but how does that work on a subscription model? I don't really know what the breakdown is for that. And then after you answer that, I'd like to ask a second
Would you
question.
just phrase that in? I didn't quite understand.
Sure. I'm asking how a pay per purchase paying your writers per each purchase of their article works on a subscription kind of model, and how they get paid if you're paying yearly. Like, how do you break that down?
Sure.
And yeah.
Yeah, so we do it, so the way we do it is we get a pool of subscription money, so subscribers, money comes in, we look at that money over a period of time, like a month, and then we say, okay, in this month, which stories have subscribers accessed, downloaded, read, and then we divide the money up according to which ones were read more. So the money gets scaled down, and then we split it. So if yours was the most read story, you will get the highest share of that month's money, and then it will be split according to your royalty split, which is usually, as I said, 50%. So,
All right,
And the other half?
Yeah, the other question was, I read this article or Q&A that you did with CJR, and you were talking about the amount of pitches you get, and how you try to respond to them basically in the way that you felt like you should have been responded to when you're applying to
try
jobs.
is the key
We try to.
word.
Not saying, yeah, no obligations. Or
probably like
anything.
people in this room who I haven't
But-
responded to.
I'm just wondering what gets you to open up that email, and also
Yeah.
what kind of experience are you looking for writers? Are there some people who don't have a lot of experience but have a really great pitch and you're willing to take a chance on them?
Great question.
I mean, it doesn't take much for us to open a pitch. We open every story pitch. Like, it's not like you're sending a screenplay into a production company and they're just like throwing them in the trash. We look at every pitch. We try to respond to every pitch. We don't always succeed at that. And I think really it sounds like so generic, but we're just like dying for great narratives. So like what we want to see in the pitch is that there are characters in the story, that there's a compelling narrative, that it goes somewhere, that there's tension that will pull you through the story. Like, we want to see that in the pitch. And if that's there, then I think we look at the writer and we kind of say, like, can this writer deliver on this story?
Thank you.
And that is a question. I mean, now it's a question that can be answered. I mean, we've had people, literally the first story they wrote out of journalism school was I think 12,000 word story for us. Because I ask journalism professors sometimes, like, who are your best students? Like, tell your students to pitch me. We're not opposed to assigning a story to anyone. We still have to find some evidence that we think you're going to deliver it, because, like I said, we can't afford to just kill stories and say like, okay, go do it, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. So why don't let's unpack that a little bit, because I know that in your time as a freelancer, you had the experience that many people have had, where you submitted a really great idea. You pitched a really great idea. You were turned down, and then of course, some months or a year later, you see your idea in the same publication by a different journalist. And you said, when we were talking about this, you said something very interesting to me that I think is an important part of her question, which is, how do you pitch a story that's not only a great idea, but that convinces you that I'm the person who can deliver that story? Because, as you said, maybe you're not the right reporter for this great idea. How do I make it so compelling, the case for me?
Yeah, I think that is, what we were talking about is like a lot of students will ask, editors, like, what if someone steals my story idea? I pitched my story idea, what if someone steals it? And I feel like editors always say, well, that's, editors don't do that, like ethical editors. And this ridiculous. Like, I have had, like, I could tell you stories of like half a dozen stories that I pitched to a magazine that they said no to, that they subsequently did that story. Now, what I believe is that they're not actually stealing those stories. Like, editors are like, they're just under the gun all the time. So they like, get this idea, and then they'll be kind of like, I don't know this writer, and like, no, we don't want to do that. It's not wired enough or whatever. And it's sort of like lodged in the back of their head. And then 6 months later, they're in a story idea meeting, and the editor-in-chief is like, you have to bring 3 ideas. And they're like, oh, I heard about this thing. Like, I pitched a story on origami once, and they were like, no, this is not for us. There's not enough in it. And then they did literally the story that I had pitched, literally exactly the same characters and everything. And what I took from that was that I should pitch stories that I own in some way or another. Like a story like Vanish, like I own it because like it's me, but you can't always be like first person with everything. So you own it because you've called people in the story before you pitched it and said like, I want to do this story about you. And actually, I know reporters who pitched a story after they had talked to like gotten the source lined up, at least a couple sources lined up. And then those sources were called by the editor that they had pitched it to, saying like, hey, we're thinking about doing this story and assigning a writer to it. And the source went back to the writer and said like, I thought you were pitching this story. This magazine is calling me now, want to do the story. What's up? And I think you have to insulate yourself in some way. I mean, you can't be paranoid about it. You can't say like, I'm not going to pitch anything because they'll steal it. You just have to say like, I'm going to pitch things that I feel like I have some ownership over that are very difficult to steal because I've either done some legwork or I have an angle on it or whatever it is. And then you also have to accept that like, sometimes they're going to steal it just like accidentally. They're probably going to steal it because you don't own the idea of doing a story about origami, And then you have to say like, I could send them a really angry email about it and never write for that publication again, or just like suck it up and find a different story and pitch it to them. Obviously they like my ideas. That's what I always said, like, God, they love my ideas. Like they're doing them. I just have to persuade them to let me be the one.
So we've talked about a little bit here about revenue and financials as it affects a specific writer and a specific assignment. But of course, they're the financials of the Atavist. And are you guys breaking even? I mean, you have, I think, your first round of financing. I mean, this isn't for free. First round of financing, $1.5 million. Second round of financing, $2+ million.
Something like that.
Your fuse is burning. You've got a burn rate, as they used to say.
Yeah, we're
where are you?
Tech startup.
Where are you now? You about to go broke, or are you going to be back in here?
No, we're good. Well, yeah, maybe if he's looking for a job. Yeah, I mean, we're in a different situation than we were when we started, because for the first 2 years we just ran on our own revenues, but most of those were software revenues. Like we've always been open about that. Like we can make way more money selling software than we can selling $2 stories. Like it's really hard to make a lot of money selling anything for $2 for a staff of now like 14 or 15 people. So we have always mixed those things, and we've always felt like we had this, whether out of luck or whatever, we have this software platform that is worth something. And even if like the journalism doesn't end up making money, even if like, God forbid, like that's not a sustainable model. Like you cannot support an organization by selling things for $2. Like we're trying to make a go of that being sustainable, but we have this other thing, and it's no different in some ways, and in a lot of ways better than having like advertising. So, it's like something's paying for something else. And so we have something that supports what we do. We happen to also do journalism. The journalism happens to be a very good advertisement for the platform itself. So it all kind of works together. But I think we raised money because we really wanted to make a go of the software as a product, as Creativist as a product that people could show up and use, as opposed to something that we kind of licensed out in this different, way, kind of quiet way. And so we hired a bunch of people, and so we spend more money than we make right now. I mean, we have, I don't know if you've ever hired a developer, but they're very expensive.
Does it worry you, Evan,
Programmers.
that the package, the software package, as beautiful as it is something that somebody else could do. Somebody else could put together and relatively.
They are.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, and
I mean,
they
you
are.
mentioned Scroll Kid, or
Yeah, they
there's
are.
like
in fact,
a bunch
There
of
are
them.
3 or 4 I
Yeah.
can think of.
Yeah,
So-
there's a bunch of little startups.
So in
doing
light of
stuff.
that, I mean, is that a sustainable business model? Or do you feel like you're going to have a whole suite of products in the future, or what do you think?
I don't know. I mean, of course, like I'm concerned about which parts of it are viable and which parts aren't. And we have, you can use it for $10 a month. You can use it for $250 a month. You can pay us a support package of $15,000 a year for like crazy white glove service. So, we have different ways of making money on it, and that's like the question at the beginning of any business. I mean, we're sort of at the beginning of this software business. So obviously we look at the numbers and the direction they go, and we say, we can project out to where we think this can go and where we can be profitable. We were profitable in the first year. So we kind of know how that works and how we can do it. Now, but it's entirely true that like things change so quickly, and they've changed since we started. So, we could get tossed aside just as easily as anyone else could get tossed aside. But, that's why we raised like what to us was a substantial amount of money so that we could weather those changes.
Well, typically, I mean, the happy ending for the software startup, you know, which is what you are, is either you get bought out by, I don't know, Microsoft, who makes it part of Bing, or Apple, who makes it part of Pages or something. You know, in other words, they take your thing, incorporate it, and move on, and you cash out, and it's great. And that's fine. But you're also a publishing enterprise,
Right.
seeking to promote profitably long-form narrative, for us, science journalism, but long-form narrative journalism. Can you succeed at both? Can you succeed at one and not at the other?
I think that we can succeed at both. I mean, like I said, I feel like they're intertwined in a helpful way for us because we're trying to do things that are sort of cutting edge in terms of design online, and so you know that feeds back into showing people what they can do with the platform itself. So I think they do fit together. I mean, yeah, normal tech startup would sort of like try to get the most number of users and then sell it to someone. I mean, that's the way of it today. Which is not to say that like we wouldn't sell it to someone, but that if that's really what we wanted, we wouldn't charge people anything. Like we would just say like use the whole thing for free.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of charging people is we have a business model from the beginning. We're not sort of like we'll get a bunch of people and then we'll figure out the business model after that, which is usually to sell it. And usually it gets shut down by whoever buys it. I mean, that's, you know.
Well, see, that's why I'm asking, because you actually are doing that. As for a single license, you're giving it away.
Yeah, but we're not giving away
but
much.
you are.
Yeah, we're not giving away much. I mean, that's almost like a way in. It's sort of like a way to get.
I understand
get
why
people
you're
in
doing
to,
it. I'm
pay
just
us
saying,
money.
you kind of are doing a left hand, right hand.
Yeah. We're doing it all. I mean, a lot of startup people would say like that's not what you should do. Like that's not the Silicon Valley way. It's not the sort of typical way that you approach a tech startup. But obviously, we're atypical in
right. It's
like
not the
5
way
different
a
ways.
journalist approaches a tech startup either.
Well, yeah, yeah.
Sir, you have a.
Hi, I'm just curious about building the network with the software. And on one hand, it's highly controlled, lots of quality. You guys edit the Atavist. You put a lot of intellectual muscle into that. And then on the other hand, you've got a vision. The people you're trying to get to buy the software may not share your vision. They may not have your quality standards. I'd like to hear you share some of your frustrations around that and the challenges around that.
Well, it is, I mean, because we don't restrict people on the front end who can use it. You know, who gets in. We don't say you're in because you've got the ability to do something highly designed and wonderful, and you're out because you don't. So there's a whole range of, even in this early stage, there's a whole range of quality in there, and also like a lot of weird things that people show up to produce that we don't even really understand. But I think that I'm not so much worried about because to the extent that we want to present something to the world, we want to say like these are the ones that go on the front page, or these are the ones that go on atavist.com, or we want to feature them in the app. Like we can decide which ones we think are great. And then if other people do something that we would find to be not that attractive, but you know, 1 million people want to read it, you know, they can, if they can get that word out, they're welcome to do that. I mean, except for the common platform restrictions about like, you know, certain types of like porn and things like that we keep off, it's pretty open. So we think of it something like Vimeo, if you've ever seen Vimeo. I mean, Vimeo is like, it's like YouTube, but it's sort of like more of a pro tool. It's more of a it's for higher end people, and you'll find everything from like true filmmakers putting wonderful stuff up there, documentaries and otherwise, to like people uploading whatever videos they've shot that day. But, you know, or in fact, this very event.
Which is, of course, very high end.
Yes, only Vimeo.
You have a question.
So, Evan, we've talked about design mostly being an aesthetic quality of the creativist. You know, you were a journalist when you had that first meeting. Like, what journalistic kind of design went into making the creativist? What were you thinking about with your frustrations as a journalist? Like, wouldn't it be cool if I could do this? And what do you kind of look for to build maybe more tools under the creativist to kind of separate it from those other platforms?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think some of my frustrations that went into it were just about not journalism in particular, but about publishing. Like a classic one is like that you buy a book and then the audiobook is sold separately for like a ridiculous amount of money. Like audiobooks are very expensive. So this idea that like when you buy this book from us, you also get the audiobook and you can just listen to one, read, you can flip back and forth, you can do whatever you want. That like you're buying a story from us. The unit that we're selling you is a story. It is in all these different forms, and once you pay us, you get them all. That was like an example of sort of saying like this sort of publishing industry thing doesn't really make sense to me. And then from a journalist's perspective, I mean, I'm actually not sure that those instincts necessarily like serve me well in a product design sense, because I was really into the structure of the extras, partly as a way, as a reporter, where you like gather all this stuff and then you give it to the fact checker at a magazine, and then it just like goes in some drawer somewhere, and you're sort of like, God, there's so much rich material. What if I could surface this? And I think that you can easily go overboard with. If you look at some of our early stories where like I was responsible for like linking the things up, there's just like a million documents, and no one's ever going to, like some like super nerd out on the story, maybe a couple people. So now we try to be more careful about that, and we're really trying to say like, where would someone have a question? Where would someone want something more, and try to give it to them? But I think the original structure of the extras came out of saying, you gather a lot of reporting, and like a lot of it could be useful to a reader, but you don't want to cram it in the narrative itself. You don't want to just like overstuff the narrative. You actually want to keep the narrative clean and then let the reader bring things in when they want, or like look under the surface, or however you want to put it.
I think we have something there, Dan, or you just? No, okay, good. Then I'd like to take the privilege of the last question.
All right.
Which is to echo what David started to ask earlier, David Sassoon out there in the dark, which is, okay, so actually the two of you, you are, for the moment, the edge of the frontier, okay?
Some days.
Yeah, some days. And it's a very momentary, position of superiority or whatever. But perhaps the rest of us think it gives you some vantage from which you can see what lies ahead. Where do you think we're headed? Where do you think we're going? What is it going to look like in 5 years, 10 years?
I'm always, usually I just sort of like refuse to answer that sort of thing, because I feel like I'm not much of a like future of journalism predictor. Like I said, like everything that I have done, I feel like I just sort of like fell into, and it didn't come from any like imagination about what things would be after time. So if I try to come up with that now, it would probably be wrong. I mean, we try to like set a direction for what we're doing, but we're also like, we're very sort of like, still feel like we try to be experimental. We still feel like we're trying to take in all the things that are happening around us and change. I feel like that to me is like the modern media organization or journalism organization is not one that does like X. Like we do 15,000 word stories and we sell them for this much, and it's a model that works. Like that may be true, but like it's really an organization that says like, we're watching what happens and we're gonna try to move with that. So we're not gonna be stuck in what we're doing. So I think the one trend that I think is like kind of incredible, I mean, other than the snowfall stuff, which I think is really interesting, obviously like that's a big part of what we do, is just the idea that when we started 4 years ago, that people would be falling over themselves to do long stories on the web. Like you would not have convinced me that that was possibly going to happen. And that is exactly what's happening. And not only is it every organization that gets brought up, like BuzzFeed has a long form editor who was fantastic, by the way, but it's also like Coca-Cola wants to do like long form stories. Like everyone, I think there is, it's not that like the world of like short things is going away, or like people's attention spans are getting longer again, or any of that kind of nonsense. It's just that when things all go in one direction, then there's room to kind of like slip in to where no one is. And like long form was the place where no one was. And now like everyone's moving that direction. The question is like, well, in 5 years from now, will everyone be saying, now we got to do something else? Like, do we have to, does it go back? But I think for now, the trend in the direction of everyone wanting to do long stories, regardless of whether the payment models are all worked out or Sometimes writers make money on them, sometimes they don't, sometimes they're getting paid well, sometimes they're not. That to me is incredibly optimistic just as a writer, as a person who cares about doing this stuff.
Well, it is incredibly optimistic, and we owe that in part to you and
thanks.
your colleagues for helping to revive.
Oh.
Oh, yes.
I have a couple of thoughts.
Oh, no. She's
Hi,
gonna
my name's
contradict everything
Olivia.
I've just
No,
said.
that's good.
Evan is my boss, so he endorses every single thing that I say. Just kidding. No, but like I know he doesn't like to be sort of like the go-to person for determining the future of long-form journalism. I mean, that's like a pretty like intense position to be under. But I really do feel like our platform, Creativist, is unique in the sense that like what is the future? What we're doing with Creativist is basically blurring the lines between writer and reader. You know, so it's a platform, it's a tool that you can, you know, all of you journalists can use to tell your stories, but then it's also something that your readers will come to and to explore your stories, and then they might realize that they have a story themselves, and then we give, you know, it's a free, you know, it's free to sign up, so it's like anybody at this point can become a publisher, can become a writer, can become a creator in the Creativist platform and tell their own stories. And so it's sort of like, forgive me, democratizing publishing in this way where it's like, you know, the old rules don't apply. Like we're sort of bringing this new model where you can publish in new ways. And I think another thing that's unique about what we do, which, you know, there are a lot of competitors and a lot of people coming up and offering these software tools, and we're excited about it because it just means that there's like a market that is interested in it. But like we publish to the web, we publish to apps, ebooks. I mean, we kind of do everything, and I think that that's you know, that can be a good thing and a bad thing. I think it's mostly good. It just makes it complicated. It makes like our jobs difficult, but I think it's worth it for us. Like we had this review of our software tool recently that said we were comprehensive, like a comprehensive tool. And that, you know, like being described as comprehensive in this sort of age of just tweets and just, you know, ephemeral sort of tools is, I think, a huge compliment. And so I'm, you know, I personally at least am excited about the future of journalism where we're kind of just empowering people to use the same tools that journalists have used for a long time.
In a way, it's sort of an extension of, you know, this was always the case. Once you had the ability to publish on the web, you know, publishing was democratized. The difference is that this is a very sophisticated tool that allows you to publish in a way that is comparable to a high-end professional publisher, and that wasn't necessarily always possible. You know, when you were just blogging in WordPress, this is a different level, and that makes it's sort of uber democratizing in that way, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting, I think what you're alluding to, there is a sort of, almost like a cyclical technological moment in the evolution of the sort of information technologies here where we find ourselves at a point in a circle where we go, wow, we're empowered. We've been democratized. We have no bar to entry. And that's happened several times, the blogging thing. The initial adoption of you know, Mosaic in the original web browsers. I mean, there was that moment. I think what's powerful and wonderful about what you and Nick and your colleagues have done and are doing is that it's being harnessed explicitly to a certain kind of in-depth journalism that was being squeezed out from the civic conversation for all kinds of very sound, interesting economic, big business, publishing, trucks, delivery problems, and that you're helping revive that. And you're helping and revive it for story-driven people like David Sassoon out there in the audience who is obsessed with a particular topic that's a key part of like our political and civic conversation going forward, and that's being empowered. And for that, I thank you, and I thank you very much for our conversation this evening. It was great.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much.